And I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Jim with SCORE, who is the moderator for tonight's program. He's going to tell us a little bit more information about the program as well as tonight's presenter, Chris Banakis.
Thanks very much, Claire. Appreciate that. Well, welcome everyone. I'm Jim Axelrad, a SCORE mentor, and I'll be serving as today's moderator. This webinar is being presented by SCORE, North Cook and Lake Counties chapter. As Claire mentioned, in partnership with Evanston, Glenview, Skokie, and Wilmette Public Libraries, along with Evanston, Glenview, Skokie, and the Wilmette Kenilworth Chambers of Commerce. We're very excited about this partnership and tonight's presentation. What we'd like you to do, I know that as you go through this and you hear the content, you'll have some questions, and there's a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You can go ahead and type your question in anytime during the program, and we will address those questions. Chris will address those at the end of the formal part of the presentation, which will last about 45 minutes or so. Now, just a little brief introduction to SCORE for those of you who are familiar with SCORE.
Hey, Jim.
Yep.
I don't know that I'm able to advance with the poll still on.
Okay.
You should be able to
I
minimize.
know.
Okay. Okay,
Here we go.
go ahead.
Well, great. SCORE is a national organization funded in partnership with the U.S. Small Business Administration, and we've been of service to small business communities across the U.S. for more than 50 years. Whether you're thinking about or in the process of starting, or you're operating a small business facing new challenges or opportunities, we're here to help. Now, SCORE has over 300 chapters with more than 14,000 volunteers across the country. We offer free and confidential business mentoring, business tools and templates, along with online seminars such as this. Chris and I are among the over 60 business mentors affiliated with the SCORE North Cook and Lake Counties chapter. We offer free and confidential mentoring, as I mentioned, at nearly 60 local mentoring sites. But now we're using virtual platforms such as Zoom and telephone until the sites and you are comfortable at mentoring in person. To request a mentor, you can go to our website, northchicago.score.org, and you'll find a search for a mentor option on the homepage. Or you can email us directly at scoreNSCLC@gmail.com. Or you can reach out to your local library or your local chamber, and they can put you in touch with us. After today's session, SCORE will send you an email featuring a webinar evaluation form. This email is all that we ask so that you can tell us how the program was, what you liked about it, and what we can do to improve it, which is always what we're trying to do. Additionally, all of you attending tonight will receive a PDF of today's slides and a link to a recording of the presentation in another email. Well, Chris, feel free to begin your presentation, and I'll rejoin you at the end of for the Q&A session.
Well, thank you, Jim. And thank you again to Claire and to all of our sponsors. We appreciate you being with us this evening, and we're really looking forward to this. Michael Gerber wrote a book called The E-Myth. Some of you may have read that. And he indicated that one of the key characteristics of successful entrepreneurs is that they're inquisitive and they always want to learn more. So I'm suspecting that we have a group of existing entrepreneurs and maybe some prospective entrepreneurs. And certainly if you're here this evening, you fit in that model. Before we get started, let me tell you a little bit about my background. I've been with SCORE 5 years now. As Jim said, I'm a mentor. I also conduct a variety of different workshops. I spent most of my career in the telecommunications industry, where I led sales, marketing, new business development teams. I also lived and worked in Hong Kong for a number of years, and I drove some sales and marketing operations throughout North Asia. I've mentored startup teams in both the high school and university level. Incubator EDU is one of the programs that I volunteer on. Some of you might be familiar with it. The program actually started in Barrington, at Barrington High School. And today it operates in over 230 high schools in 22 states, including Japan and Mexico. So it's really grown dramatically in, I think, 6 or 7 years that it's been on around. The winning teams actually pitch their ideas in the same way a Shark Tank kind of program would be done, and they can win tens of thousands of dollars as a way to fund their new business. So it's really a very exciting, great program, and the students really enjoy coming up with the ideas. And finally, I run a little boutique consulting practice where I assist startups in launching new businesses. And so it's really been a delight for me. I spent a good deal of my career, I mentioned, in the telecommunications industry, actually worked with Motorola. And while I was there, I worked with a CEO named Bob Gelvin. Now, Bob was a really big advocate of training and continuous improvement. And in fact, for those of us who worked there at that time, it was required that you took 40 hours of training every year. And Bob always preached that when you attended a training program, you want to look for at least one nugget, something that you can take away. So that's my goal this evening, folks. My goal is to hopefully provide you with at least one nugget that you can take away. Now, normally at this point in the presentation, it's my opportunity to find a little bit about each of you and interact a little bit. But it's tough with a webinar. I know for those of you who have done webinars in the past, you know, it's so tough because we don't have the interaction with our audience. I mentioned I work with the high school group and I volunteer, and I will tell you I have the highest admiration for teachers because they've had to work with online, and it is not easy. It really isn't. So here's my goal. Here's my goal. I am hoping that the group here is going to be Group B on the bottom and not Group A. So I'm going to work very hard for a Group B response, because I suspect that those of you who are joining us this evening fall into one of 3 categories. Either you're an existing entrepreneur and you're looking for new ways to grow your business, a prospective entrepreneur that's looking to gather data on how you might want to launch your business, or the third group, you're tired of watching the Olympics and you decided to try something new. Regardless, it doesn't matter, regardless of what it is. I'm glad you're here, and we'll work to make sure it's a good event for you. I must admit, I really miss not being able to get together in person, and I hope that'll change very, very soon. So let's get started. Here's the reality, folks. We've all had to deal with an incredibly challenging 18 months. I mean, this has been a very, very tough time. And I can't minimize the impact it's had on small business owners. It really has been profound. And the disruptions in the supply chain and the labor shortages, and they're continuing. I'd like to say that things are getting better. But it's hard to predict the future. I mean, every day there's a new impact from the CDC, and I'm sure it's something that's wreaking havoc with each of you, those of you who are running your own business today. So what we do know is even before COVID came on the scene, running your own business was a challenging and difficult situation. The SBA showed that in the first 5 years, about 50% of the small businesses actually will not survive. And here's the interesting thing. The major contributor to that was really no market need. And this is amazing, but probably not surprising. You know, a lot of times we get excited about an idea. We talk to some family members or a few friends. People are encouraging, and sometimes we launch maybe a little too early. But we do realize it's a hard business. It really is very, very difficult. So let's think about why 50% of these businesses do survive, because that's where we want to focus this evening. We don't want to focus on the ones who are struggling. We want to focus on the ones that are being successful. What do? Well, one of the big things they do is they focus. They focus on the customer. And actually, I learned that lesson when I was 7 years old. Now, the handsome looking guy in the right-hand portion of your screen with the bow tie on is my grandfather. And he started a little restaurant and candy shop in Oak Park in the early 1900s. When I was 7 years old, I used to walk home from school and I would sit on the stool on the counter in the farthest stool, and I'd wait for my mother to finish up because she would be waiting tables. It was a big family business. My grandfather frequently was in the basement making candy, and he was kind of known for that. And so he would work hard making candy. And one of the things I observed is periodically he would walk up from the basement and he had a large tray filled with small pieces of candy. And he would go from table to table, offering the candy to the different customers who were there that day and asking them two questions. One is, do you like it? And the second one is, if I offered it, would you buy it? If I offered it for sale, would you buy it? Those were his two questions. And if you think about it, that's a pretty effective way to gather some customer input, right? Is to actually let them participate in the process before he went to the effort of actually packaging it and putting it on the counter. He wanted to get some feedback ahead of time. Well, another person who did this exceptionally well was Steve Jobs. And he said it. He said, you've got to start with the customer experience and then work your way backwards, right? It does start with a customer. We want to understand what the customer's needs are. And Steve Jobs, I suspect any of you, whether you're a big advocate of Apple products or not, certainly would admit that he understood customers and was focused on them throughout his career at Apple. One of the things that's fairly popular now is this called a customer flywheel. And what is the customer flywheel? Well, it's really the idea that the customer is in the center of the operation. That's where all the energy has come from. You know, once you have a sale, that customer is working to actually be a promoter of your product. And they're communicating what they like and what they're delighted at. They're engaged in the process, which is different from kind of the traditional funnel where the customers were at the bottom of the funnel. So this is a different way to view it. But once again, I think it's emphasizing this whole idea that customers are really at the center of your business. Here's another way to look at it. There's really three elements that every entrepreneur, I guess every business, in fact, if you put it that way, wants to look at when they think about their whole customer experience. One is they want to get customers, right? That's kind of the driving force most companies talk about. They want to get new customers. They want to think about ways to do that, how to attract new business. The middle is that they want to keep the customers. Well, they've spent money trying to get customers, trying to get them in. They want to keep customers. So how do they do that? Well, they do it with loyalty programs, they do it with product updates, they do it with customer sat surveys, they do with customer call-ins and check-in calls. So there's a variety of ways that customers want to, or excuse me, the companies want to keep their customers, because that's an important element. Because if they do a really good job, then those customers grow into even bigger customers, right? With referrals, with upselling, with new products and services that they might offer. So that's a kind of a little bit of a different way to look at that. But again, the customers are in the center of this process. This evening, we're going to focus on the 5 components that are necessary in maximizing the impact of your marketing plan. Now, obviously, in the time we have together, we're really only going to be able to scratch the surface on this. But you can always dig deeper. You can certainly connect with your SCORE mentor, as Jim mentioned earlier. But I'd also emphasize that the SCORE website has a wealth of information. They've got other webinars that are focused on other component pieces of what we're going to be talking about. They've got articles, they've got white papers, and by the way, it's all free. So I would encourage you to do a little research if there's an area that we touch on tonight that you'd like to get a little bit more information on. So here are the 5 elements: who, where, why, what, and how. Well, let's take a look at each of them. Who? Well, who's your customer? Any good marketing program starts with the who. And who's your customer? How much do you know about your best customer? Steve Blank, who's a serial entrepreneur, and by the way, he has a terrific website. It's steveblank.com. It's B-L-A-N-K. And it has a wealth of information, presentations, video. For those of you who have some time, I encourage you just to take a look at the website. But he's a serial entrepreneur. He also works with graduate students around the country. And one of the stories he talks about is what they like to do with many of the startup owners and teams is to actually toss them a felt tip pen and say, go up to the whiteboard and tell us everything you can about your best customer. So here's the question I have for you. If someone tossed you the marker, what would you tell them about your customer? Now, one of the things that if you've gone out for funding, if you've gone out for investment with either angel investors or VC investors, one of the things they'll frequently want to know is how many customer interviews can you conducted, and what did you learn as a result of it? And based on what you've learned, are you going to persevere and go forward with it, or are you going to pivot and do something differently? So this is a interesting thing for you to give some thought to if you haven't done it already, is if you could define for someone who your ideal customer would be. Of course, yeah, here, large companies, they've got very sophisticated ways to do it. They spend a lot of money doing it and getting feedback. Hey, earlier in the session when we started up, we did a little poll, right, to grab some analytics on those of you who are attending and how you found out about the program. So finding out about customers and getting customer feedback is an important element that all companies understand. Now, while they can do that, they've got a whole lot of money. It's a little harder when you run your own business, right? You're an entrepreneur, you're trying to do a lot of things. But one of the things that makes it very successful is you are able to go one-on-one with customers. And I'll tell you, as I talk to entrepreneurs today, after COVID, in the midst of COVID, one of the things I find out is as their companies are coming back and their businesses are coming back, what they've told me is, hey, you can't be an absentee owner. You've got to be there. And it's one of the important elements of it because they want to talk to their customers. And that's a wonderful opportunity for you to do that. And there's a variety of things you can actually do, even in a smaller business. One thing you can do is some brief customer interviews, right? So if you have somebody and they're shopping and they're at your store or they're in your business, it's an opportunity for you to maybe do a little interview. Maybe if you ask them for a little advice, maybe it's a new product you've just introduced or a new service that you're thinking of offering. Maybe you haven't done it yet, but you're thinking about that. And I think most customers you will find are very flattered that you've asked their advice and you've asked their input. And, you know, I mean, you can say thanks for your help. Maybe there's a little giveaway you can have for them just to thank them for their help. Maybe it's a coupon that you would give them. But it's a way for you to engage and interact with them. Another thing you can do are customer workshops or demonstrations. We had a realtor in our neighborhood who offered, right after property taxes came out, who offered to conduct a workshop on how to lower your property taxes. Now, he had it in one of the local restaurants. He got a meeting room there, and he had a huge turnout for this, as you can imagine, right on the heels of getting our property tax bill. But he brought in an attorney who kind of talked through some steps in the process. And I will tell you, since that period of time, virtually all the homes in our neighborhood are being sold by him. So people really appreciated what he did in conducting a process like that. A third thing you can do and give some thought to, and I've mentioned this to a variety of companies that I've worked with and entrepreneurs, is a customer advisory panel. Now, it's something that a lot of large companies do, but there's really no reason that you couldn't do with a smaller company. So for instance, if you were a restaurateur and you had a customer advisory panel and you invited this group of customers, maybe to test some of the items that you were thinking of putting on your menu next month, and getting some feedback before you went ahead and printed a new menu and brought the items in. Part of it is to get a feedback from them. Another part is to establish that relationship with your customer and to certainly retain those good customers that you have out there in the marketplace. You could get an advisory panel that you can connect with via Zoom. I think you would find that, again, I think people would be very pleased, very flattered to be asked. You wouldn't want to monopolize their time, but certainly tapping into them. And I think you'd also find that they would be great advocates for your business, especially if they knew that some new products were going to be coming out or some new menu items are going to be offered. These are folks who can go out and do that. So I encourage you to at least explore that idea, see how that might work for you. Now, one of the things that you also want to do, you want to know who your customer is, but you want to know where they are. Where will you find them? Well, again, it's a variety of ways. One is in your store itself or in your business itself that we just talked about. But there's a variety of ways that you hook up with customers and connect with customers. I worked with a group of new entrepreneurs who had come up with a product for runners, and they had defined their target customers as runners between the age of 25 and 45. They had what they thought they would earn, how often they ran, what kind of distances, what kind of races they participated in. And so one of the things they were trying to think of, well, how would we kind of connect with those customers and interview them and get some feedback from them? And they thought about some of the running stores. Dick Pond, I think, has a running club. They went in, talked to him about it, talked to the people at the store, and they said, in fact, we do have a running club. And it meets every evening at this time in this location. And they asked, would it be okay if we went and maybe chatted with some of the people? Absolutely, not a problem with that. So they went and they met them, talked about what they were trying to do and what their ideas were, got some feedback, and then said, I wonder if when we actually develop our minimal viable product, our MVP, could we come back and get some feedback from you? Yeah, absolutely, anytime. Come on back. We look forward to it. Well, they actually did go back. They gave some samples of the product to the runners to use, and actually then met with them afterwards and got some feedback on how they liked the product, how it worked for them, whether they would buy it, what they would pay for it, whether they've seen anything like it before. So there's interesting ways you can do. If you're a B2B type business, certainly trade shows. I know that hasn't been something that's been able to occur in the last couple of years, but I think they're coming back now. More companies are talking about those reoccurring. Of course, online. We'll talk about the digital component of this in just a little while, but online is another way that you can connect with your customers in a variety of forums that are available for you. So knowing who your customers are and where you can find them are the first two components of an effective marketing plan of maximizing that. But you also want to know why they should buy from you. What drove them to your business in the first place? Here's the thing, you want to understand what problem are you solving for them? You understand what your target market is, but you need to really understand what your UVP is, what's your unique value proposition. So you've got your pains and your gains on the right side. You're going to be the pain alleviator or the gain creator. That's what you're going to be offering. And you want to look for the fit. You want to understand what the fit is between what you're offering and what you're solving for them. If you recall, when we said earlier that of the largest percentage of reasons that customers or that businesses failed in the first 5 years were no market need. And I think this speaks to this whole idea that you've got to really focus a lot of attention on making sure, especially if you're a new entrepreneur or somebody that's looking towards actually launching a business, making sure that you're solving an important problem for your target audience. So, how are you going to compete in the marketplace? What's your competitive advantage? How are you going to leverage that when you're actually out there marketing? What value do you provide? The same thing as we talked about your UVP. What's your value? The best marketing messages, because part of a good marketing plan is having good marketing messages. They speak to customers in a language that resonates with them. They understand it. Well, how do you know if it resonates with them? Well, you ask them, right? You talk to your customers and get some feedback. I just saw an article today about a new business that's being launched. It originally was launched in Turkey. It's now expanded in Europe, and it's now expanding in a couple of cities in the United States. Here's what they're offering. They're offering 10-minute delivery on grocery products. And what they found is that, especially over COVID, the majority of the people, they wanted maybe some wine, some pasta, maybe they had a few other products that they wanted. So they're setting up warehouses, and then they've got a whole logistical process of going out and making sure they're going to guarantee, like FedEx did, if you remember, when they said when it absolutely positively has to ship overnight. That's what made them unique. People doubted that they could do that. Well, they figured out a way to do that. And this is an interesting new process. You know, are they able to deliver in 10 minutes? As we've seen, Amazon is doing more of the same day delivery. It's interesting why people buy from someone. You do that in a variety of ways. The question I always ask is, what's your story? I think that's what customers are interested in. What's your story? How'd you get started? Why did you start this business? Some of these stories are a little easier to tell. You know, whether a family member, grandfather, great-grandfather, grandmother started something, got you interested in it. You know, your story is an interesting part of why people sometimes want to connect with you. There's a my brother just forwarded me this Instagram little video, and it's a restaurant in the southwest suburbs of the Chicagoland area. And every day, the owner of the restaurant makes a little video, no more than 30 seconds, 45-second video, and he highlights one of the specials that they're having that day. And he's kind of a classic owner of an Italian restaurant, and he really gets engaged, and he talks about the products, he talks about the ingredients that go into it. He's animated, and he's actually in the kitchen doing the demonstration, and you can see everything going on in the background. And at the end, he has a little tagline. He says, "Hey, remember, if you're my friend, you're never going to starve." And you know what? He's gotten a cult following. This little video is being sent to people around, and he did it on his own. Probably didn't cost him anything. And he's enjoying that he's getting some nice following now, and is telling the story of his business and his restaurant. And I bet you have a story. I bet you have something unique about what you do and why you're doing it. And it's an important reason that you can highlight when you're actually marketing. The fourth component of any good marketing program is identifying what action you'd like your target audience to take. Now, this can be done in a variety of ways. So let's look at this ad. Here it is. Who's it going to go to? The friends and family, right? It's friends and family sale. They're going to give a special discount and free shipping. Well, what's the action item? It's this week only. So there's a deadline to help drive the action. So you want to think to yourself, what action do you want your customer to take? Now, online, you've probably seen a variety of these, whether it's add it to the cart, get a free proposal, request a demo, push the button, see how it works. So a whole bunch of things you can do that drive action so that there's some result that's coming in. Why do you want that result? Why is that so important? Well, it's the final component of any effective marketing plan. And the final component of a great marketing plan is you want to get feedback. You want to have some kind of a measurement mechanism. It's how you'll decide if the plan was successful or not, of what you did. Now, in today's environment, there are a variety of different ways that you can measure success. It really depends on what your objective is. Are you trying to create awareness, gain acceptance, drive adoption? There's really not one size that fits all. A new startup may view success in a very different way than an established business. I know typically we think, well, we're going to measure sales, and that's one way. It's a really good way, but you may measure it in some different ways if maybe that's not your primary purpose of sending out your program or doing your marketing program at that particular point in time. These are some of the methods and metrics of how you can do that. These are just some. You can ask those of you who are members of the Chambers of Commerce. I'm sure that a lot of the members have different ways that they've done it. That's a great resource for you to use to tap into. So I encourage you to do that. You can look online. There's a lot of search engines that can provide some good information to you. So what are the key components of a successful marketing plan? One is you know your customer, you know who they are, and you understand how they operate. You know where you can find them. You know where they're located. You know where they shop. You know where they research new products and services. You understand why they should buy your product or service, why that's important to them, what problem you're going to solve. You know what they want them to do. You understand what action you'd like them to take, and you understand how to measure success. So those are the 5 components that we've covered this evening. But I also promised you that we'd take some time to talk about how companies have effectively been fighting back after COVID. What have they done that have made them successful during even this most difficult time? Well, I would tell you there's 3 things that they have done very effectively. One is they've done a really good job of staying connected with their customers, even during this very, very difficult time. Now, one of the things I know is, I'll give an example, Weber Grill. Weber Grill, when they had to move online and they would do takeout, they would throw in cookies. And along with the cookies was a little thank you. A thank you for doing business with them. And just a little way that we would say thank you, a couple of cookies. I'm sure it didn't cost them a whole lot, but it's something that people talked about. People remembered what they did. It was very effective. Another thing we said is you stay connected with your customers by talking to them. Now, I'll give you 2 examples of something that happened to me. I was shopping in the midst of COVID, and I went to one store. Now, I was the only person in the store, and there were 2 people checking out customers. I happened to be the only one. And I came with my product, and the person checking me out never acknowledged me. And by the way, this is a store with a reward program, and I was a reward customer. I actually was inputting my information. Didn't acknowledge me. The 2 of them were actually talking back and forth to one another and talking about some new policy the store was putting into place. At the end of the transaction, they finally said, "Oh, thanks." I took my product and left. Now, I'll compare that with another customer experience I had. I went to Trader Joe's. Now, may or may not be a shopper of Trader Joe's, but my experience as I went in, the first thing that I was asked is I was greeted, and then they asked me, "Well, did you find everything I was looking for?" I said, "Well, actually, there was one product I couldn't find. I probably was looking in the wrong place." She said, "Well, I know where that is. Just a minute, I'll get it." I said, No, there's people standing in line." She said, "Nope, I'll be quick. I'll get it." She ran off, got the product, brought it back, put it in my bag, and said, "By the way, is it still warm outside?" It's been warm. So we chatted a little bit, and she said, "Oh, you're buying this one product." She said, "There's a great recipe on the back. I bet you'll enjoy it. I've made it myself, and it was terrific." So just a little bit of interaction that we had together, and thank me very much for coming out, especially during this difficult time. So what store do you think I want to go back to and give more business? And it's all about that kind. And I'm sure all of you can share some stories that you've gone through and had some similar experiences. Now, here's an example of a realtor who is keeping in touch. And how are they doing it? Here's some places where kids can eat free. Well, hey, there's a great opportunity for you to, you're not talking about your business, you're not going into details on that, but you're providing a nice service that probably your target audience would find really valuable. I know other realtors sometimes send out a schedule for pro sports teams. That's another thing I think people probably appreciate. We talked about demos. Here's a little cooking demo. I mean, that's something that people can find very useful. One of the things that many folks have talked about over the past 18 months or so is how often they've used YouTube in order to just, figure out how to do something. It's been our go-to. If something's broken, if we need something, we've used YouTube. And boy, an opportunity for you to maybe do some kind of demonstration about your product or service that might be helpful to them. But let me tell you why that's important. It's the second area of why companies have been really successful, those who have been really successful, and that is that they've made a successful digital transformation. They figured out how to go online. And let me tell you, it has not been easy. But here's the reality, and this was even before the COVID came through, is that 97% of consumers search online for products and services. And 4 out of 5 use their smartphone to shop. So the question I'd have for you is, what have you done from an online standpoint? What's your website look like? Is it easy for people to navigate that? Do you actually, are they able to shop on your website? Are they able to get information about your company? One of the things that I frequently hear is I talk to new businesses and companies, and I'll ask them about their website. How did you do it? What does it look like? And they'll say, I've got a friend of my son's in high school. He's great. He knows everything about computers. He's going to do my website. Well, I will tell you, folks, that may not always be the very best thing to do. You want to really think about what you're doing with that, what kind of business you want to transact on your website, and make sure you've got something that's very effective. This, again, is a place you can get some customer feedback on. So really, what are your typical objectives when you're working with a digital marketing program? One is you're looking to get brand awareness. You want to get your brand out there. You want to get your information out there about your company. Second, many companies want to get lead generation. Again, you can do that in a variety of ways that can be very, very effective. You can educate potential customers, so you can provide some educational services. Then you can do some sales generation that can come to it. We had a small little taco shop in town that had to very, very quickly figure out how to operate online. And they have done a terrific job, and I'm sure it has not been easy for them. A lot of churches have talked about having to do live feeds and live streaming of their services, and having never had to do it before. You know, if one of the big mega churches, they probably do that on a regular basis, but for most others, it was a whole new experience. And so they had to figure out, how are we going to do this? Now, basically, you find there are 3 elements of any digital marketing program. One is permission-based marketing. What is that? Well, that's email, right? How many times when you go in a store and they ask if they can get your email address, they'll send you your receipt, or they'll ask for your email address. Well, that's very valuable information. And with that, they're asking permission to send you some information. Now, one of the companies that's fairly well known in this area is Constant Contact. There are others, but you have to be very careful with email and permission-based, because people will quickly unsubscribe if you're not managing that in the right way. I have seen certainly many people have been very frustrated with giving that information and being bombarded by the company with emails from up and down the company pushing to sell them something or to have them act on a certain program. Second is engagement marketing. Engagement marketing, many of you might be familiar with. That's Facebook, it's Instagram, it's Twitter. They want some kind of engagement. They want some feedback. They want some interaction with you. Those are some of the more popular ones. So that's a second way that you can potentially have some marketing program. And third is individual marketing. And this is where someone actually gains enough information about you that they know what you might like. Well, I noticed that you've purchased this and this, and I thought you might be interested in this as well. So that's gathering customer data. One of the companies that does it exceptionally well, obviously, is Amazon. Most of us have probably had that experience where you've gotten an email from them about a product that's similar to something else that you've had already. There's no shortage of online operations, online companies, online businesses. There's nothing that says what is the very best one. The very best one are the ones that you're going to be able to reach your customers with. And let me tell you, it is ever changing. The very best ones or the most popular ones or the most used ones a few years ago are different today. There's new companies popping up all the time. You're trying to get that right, trying to figure that out. Again, you're going to want to get some feedback from customers to find out where they find out about new information, new products and services. So there's a variety of ways that you can market. Some are paid, some are organic. Word of mouth. I suspect many of you have found that word of mouth is one of your most effective forms of marketing. Local marketing. We just talked about email. Influencer marketing. This is fascinating. Right? Years ago, we would say endorsements might be by actors or famous sports figures. But today, there are social media influencers who many of you might not even be familiar with, but they might be very, very impactful in your given area in terms of influencing their users to buy your product or service. So it's something for you to explore to see if there may be some opportunities for that. Now, that may be a cost to you, but it may be a good return on your investment if they're very successful and effective. One of the other things I would recommend is actually doing a search. It's always been amazing to me how much information is available in a simple search. So here is 26 restaurant marketing ideas, how to market a restaurant. I'm sure you can find that for a whole variety of different businesses. Now, are they all going to work for you? Are they all something you're going to? No. But in 26, maybe there's a couple. Maybe there's some nuggets in there. Something that you thought, yeah, I've never done that before. Maybe that's something that we should think about or we should try. I think that's a very important element for you to at least investigate. Finally, the final one is, I think companies that have been most successful during this time have been companies that have had to really redefine their objectives. It's been a very difficult time. The companies that have been successful have been companies who could pivot quickly, have been agile, have been able to navigate the environment, which has been changing and is still changing, as we know. So, for instance, your primary objective prior to all this may have been growth. Today, maybe it's employee retention. Maybe today it's customer retention. Why? Because you've got challenges with your supply chain. You can't deliver. How many companies today are suffering because they can't deliver? You're trying to buy a car today. There are no cars on the lot. So this is a tough time, and it requires companies to redefine what their objectives are. So here's just a couple of companies that had to make some change, right? It's not finger-licking good anymore. It's mouth-watering good. And home is now a McDonald's. So it's thinking about how you can use those tools and how you can be very successful in that area. So let's think about how you can be successful even during something like COVID. You can stay connected with your customers. You can really focus on a digital transformation and how to make sure you can get your business online and operating online, because that's how many people are going to find you, and that's how they're going to connect with you. And finally, you got to think about your objectives and what you want to look at and what you want to focus on going forward that perhaps might be different than what you did in the past. So I want to thank again our partners who helped us during this program. We certainly appreciate your participation, and all of you who have joined us this evening, thank you for giving your time. I want to spend some time, and I know I moved a little bit quickly, but I want to make sure we had some time for questions. So I want to turn it back to Jim, and hopefully he's got a few questions, and I'm happy to answer those for you. By the way, as Jim mentioned, we are going to, and we did record this, so my email information is there. So if you think of something later on that just comes to you, feel free to reach out to me. I'll be happy to help you, or as I mentioned before, any of your SCORE mentors. Jim?
Thanks, Chris. We're getting a lot of really good questions, so let's get started. First question I have is from Patty. Patty says, my son is just starting out a video editing service. What would you recommend as the most effective way to publicize his business?
So he's going to do a video editing
Yes.
service. So what I would say is for him to once again think about who would likely be the people who would be purchasing his video editing business. So clearly he must have wonderful technical skills that he's able to do that. But there are companies out there and businesses out there that would probably be his target audience. And I would say the first thing he would want to do is to identify who those people might be and see if he can possibly contact a few of them and find out a little bit more about them. Find out who they're using today, what's working well with that, what's not working very well with that, what they would change if they could, and how they learn about new products and services. I think that, companies, if you'd be surprised how effective networking works. Well, most people wouldn't, but, being able to ask around and find out who might be in a business like that and to go ahead and interact with them. Now, I say that, but I will also tell you, having to work with many students, that's something that they can be a little reluctant about, is actually interviewing prospective companies or individuals. But I think it's a wonderful exercise, and it's something that the only way you get better at is that you do it. So that would be my advice.
Great answer. I have a question here from Sarah, and I'm going to read this to you. She gives an example, so bear with us a little bit. She's asking, are there still merits to creating physical advertising for local businesses despite the major focus on the online shopping side of retail? And then the example she gives is, I'm thinking of creating small table tents that take a potential customer to my website or a QR code to advertise my business of accessories in local bridal shops that'll allow it. I think she's got a better understanding of this than she thinks, but go ahead, Chris, what's your response?
So I would say absolutely. Now I'll give you another example of that. A friend of mine works with a lot of folks in terms of providing them health insurance information for folks who are on Medicare right now, like a Medicare supplement program. Now, what they found is they are certainly investing, these companies, in digital advertising, but what they found is a good many of their target customers aren't that actively involved with digital advertising. And in fact, one of the best ways to reach them is regular mail. And so this is still a big part of their program. Also television ads, also in magazines, also newspaper ads. So you're spot on. I think that, Sarah, it's the right way to do it. Is certainly it's a wonderful way to get started. And while online could be very effective and it's something you at least want to be thinking about for the future, it's a good way to kind of get your name out there and start getting some brand awareness going.
That's great, Chris. Thanks. Now, here's a question from John. And John says, what are some marketing mistakes companies make aside from hiring a brother-in-law to build their website?
I think the other thing they do is they don't build it with analytics in mind of how you're going to measure activity on your website. So Google Analytics is has some great tools. It's free. It's something to investigate. But one of the things that you want to make sure you're doing when you're designing your website, and by the way, there are folks that have done great presentations from SCORE just on this subject. But one of the things you want to do is make sure you're incorporating the right information in your website that you can get effective feedback from the analytics that you're going to put into play. So search engine optimization, what words you're using, how many clicks you're getting, what pages they're coming to first, what's your landing page, what do you want to have coming up first? And I'm just touching on some. There are many, many more. And you really, this is a subject unto itself, but I would say that it is the one area that I find that more people try to save money on. And I think, especially in today's environment, it is a real mistake. And you should really investigate what the best way to put that together, do some research on that, look at some of these webinars, and then carefully make a decision on what you want to do in terms of putting that together.
Thank you. Here's a question. We have a participant who is a public notary doing loan signing for people and businesses. How would you recommend marketing my service?
It's an interesting question. One of the things I would think about is, I think realtors are a group that might be very helpful in that regard. You know, one of the things I've found with the very best realtors is that they always know someone in a variety of different areas. And if you have an issue, they've usually got someone they can recommend who does that. And so that might be something that they want to begin working with some of the more successful realtors in the area who would be, you know, that's one area that would be mortgages, right? That would be home loans or mortgages that they would have that he would do. So if I understand it correctly, that might be one area that they could explore. The other, I would go back to what we talked about before, and you know, you really want to spend a little time to say, who are my target audiences? You know, I think one of the areas that companies frequently will struggle with is they will get excited about an idea, a product and service, and they will launch. I mean, we've already had companies, even with the SCORE operation, who have signed leases on buildings for offices, for space, and their long-term leases before they've really gone out and seen whether there's a real need for this product or service. So I would test who the competition is, how they're reaching their customers, who that target audience is, and again, see how you want to start tapping into that group. But the realtors are just one idea.
Okay, and we've got one final question here. It comes from Gary, and Gary says, I have a marketing business and my customers are directors and VPs of marketing, but I'm having challenges getting past their gatekeepers. Now, you talk about social media, but I don't know that they would be hanging out on social media and open to my solicitations. What would you recommend I do?
I think Gary's bringing up one of the challenges that a lot of small businesses have is, you know, trying to get to the right customer. There are gatekeepers in place, and that can make it very challenging. So I understand the obstacles that you're dealing with, Gary. One of the things I would say is, you know, it's critically important for you to try to figure out how you can get, some companies call it lighthouse accounts, some companies call it a reference account, companies call it you know, our main endorsement account. How do you get your first customer? And you may need to, maybe it's a special price for them to get started, to go. So that may be one way that you can, try to get that first customer and then leverage that customer to some other companies. The other thing I would say is sometimes trade shows are a very effective way for you to go out and meet some of these people. I often found that industry trade shows could be a very effective. In fact, I would look on the agenda for the event and see if any of my prospective customers were going to be on the panels for some of the workshops or presentations. And I would make sure I attended those. And afterwards, I would go up and introduce myself and try to see if I could set up a future appointment with them. So, from a B2B standpoint, that's one way that you can begin getting in. That's a little bit of an investment, but frequently it's not that expensive if you're just going as an individual and attending a show. So you want to look for a trade show where many of your customers might be attending. Get started at one space and see if you can get in. Joining those industry associations is another way. They have a lot of members and it's a way to connect. And of course, the Chamber of Commerce is another way. I know they've got a lot of events that go on where you can connect with other companies that might be good targets for you. So those are just a few ideas that could be helpful.
Thanks, Chris. Julie has a question. She said she'd like to hire someone to be in charge of marketing for her business, but as a new business owner, my marketing budget is not large. Do you have suggestions on how to start looking for someone and what I should expect as far as the cost?
So that's a great question. One of the things I would say is you might want to contact some of the business schools. We've got a lot of colleges and universities here, and the head of the business department, many of them want to have internships for students. And they've got students who are going to be graduating in another year. They'd like to get an internship. They'd like to have that on their resume. So one of the things you could consider doing is bringing an intern in and actually letting them, you can interview them. Usually that's a relatively low cost thing for you to do. You're getting an energetic, enthusiastic future marketer to come in and kind of help you out and get started. And who knows, if it really goes well, maybe they want to continue to work with you in the future. Frequently, I know some of our companies have done that, and they've found that these folks also have been terrific at helping them with their online marketing. So that might be something for you to explore as a way to get started without having to invest a whole lot of money on the front end. And I think that can be a win-win for you and for the college and university.
Great. And I've got a question here about Mark, and Mark wants to know about the sensitivity of marketing his product. So he says, I plan to use a t-shirt to market my brand to women. I'm also planning on donating money to breast cancer research to help boost sales to increase brand awareness. What are the positive and negative issues I need to think about?
Well, yeah, that could be a sensitive issue, Mark. One of the things I think you could potentially do is bring together your own focus group to at least get some feedback on the front end about what the reaction would be. And by the way, I always encourage people when they're going to do this, not to just do family and friends, because frequently they're going to tell you what you want to hear, but maybe to reach out a little farther than that and get some feedback on it. I think what you're dealing with here could be a very sensitive issue. It might not be something that would be received very well. So I would test it or the number of areas ahead of time. You also may want to talk with somebody who's actively involved with breast cancer research, or not research, but breast cancer programs that are available right now, that are advocacy programs for research money. You may want to talk to their directors and their people and just, say, hey, I've got an idea I'm working on. But before I do that, I really would love to get some feedback from people who are actively involved in this area. And maybe let me explain what I'm thinking of doing, and maybe you can give me your impression of what you think about that. So that might be another thing you could do.
Chris, I think that brings us to a close. A lot of great questions. So we want to thank all our participants for joining us tonight and asking all those wonderful questions. And we certainly want to thank Chris Banakis for providing this time and very valuable content. I also want to, in closing, thank the libraries, the public libraries of Evanston, Glenview, Skokie, and Wilmette, along with the Evanston, Glenview, Skokie, and Wilmette Kenilworth Chambers, who were so gracious in supporting tonight's program. As a reminder, SCORE will send you a PDF of Chris's slides and an evaluation form. I hope everyone will take just a few minutes to give us your evaluation, because we really sincerely value your feedback. Chris spoke a lot about feedback. We really want to get to know what we can do to help you, as well as also improve in the types of programs that we present. And if you are looking for a mentor, you can go visit our website, northchicago.score.org, and fill out a request for a mentor, and we'll be happy to be in touch with you. Well, thanks, everyone. That concludes our program. Thank you again. Have a great night, and wish you all success in your businesses.